Hi, and welcome to the first Urgos.co.uk podcast. Today we're going to be talking about how to get startup funding with angel investors. Now, this is actually the podcast version of the blog post that we published some months ago. And we promised in our YouTube video on the blog post that we'd go into a bit more detail about some of the things that we were talking about, just to help startups, just get a good feel of how to get an angel investor. Please also check out our YouTube video, which is on our Urgos content YouTube channel. And please also like and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So our Facebook is @UrgosTech and our Twitter is UrgosTech as well. So let's jump right in. How to get startup funding with angel investors. So getting startup funding can actually be one of the most difficult obstacles when it comes to starting a business. We definitely found that in our experience. There's a lot of information out there. It can be a bit daunting. There's lots of different funding mechanisms, but knowing which one applies to you and your startup can be quite confusing. And especially sort of knowing what applies to you and your startup at the specific stage that your startup is currently at, that can be a bit difficult to understand. So like I said, we've created this guide to help you understand specifically how angel investors can help you with that, and basically to explain what your pitch needs in order for an angel investor to be interested, what things they look out for. Let's face it, you're probably listening to this podcast because you're probably an entrepreneur or you want to be an entrepreneur one day. You can see successful people all over the world that are actually living their dream because they had the guts to actually go out there and start their business. You're probably also sick of being an employee, having that 9 to 5 and having a job, J-O-B, which some people say means just over broke. And you want to be your own boss. You want to wake up when you want to wake up. You want to manage your own team. You want to have the freedoms of being the actual business owner. We feel the same way, and that's why we started Urgos. So if that's you, you're definitely in the right place. Before we get into explaining how angel investors can help your startup with funding, it's important to understand what the various funding rounds are. Now, funding rounds are important because you need to know how much equity you want to give away at various stages. You don't want to give away too much equity at the very early stages of your business, which is why we feel it's key for any startup to have this information. So the various funding rounds are the seed funding round, which can be anything from £500,000 to £1 million plus, depending on the industry and sector, of course. Series A funding, which can be from £2 to £10 million. And that's typically for sort of businesses that have received their seed funding and have actually launched and started their company. Okay, so Series A startup would sort of use that to upscale their business after they've brought their product to the market. You want to grow and expand. So that's the next level. Series B funding, which can be approximately £7 to £15 million, again, depending on industry or sector. And Series C funding, which could potentially be up to hundreds of millions of pounds, again, depending on the sector. So an example of how Series C funding would be used for, let's just say that your company has a competitor that has a supply line that you want, as an example. You could actually go for a seed funding round for Series C to actually buy that company. That's usually sort of much later on, and that usually involves big venture capital firms. But in this guide, we're actually going to focus on the seed funding round, because this is where angel investors play the most important role, we feel. So the seed funding round, as the name suggests, is the initial funding required to plant the seed for your business to be able to grow. Seed funding is typically for pre-revenue startups. So that's startups that haven't actually launched their product or service to the market yet. The seed funding can be really helpful, especially in the technology sector, to a startup in securing the intellectual property, for example. So intellectual property, things like patents, trademarks, and registered designs, for example. Seed funding can also be used to fund the development of prototypes. That can be obviously a hardware prototype or software prototype, or, for example, in the fashion sector, that can be used to actually produce samples. The seed funding can also be used to fund some of the day-to-day expenses. So getting your website built, doing some digital marketing, stuff like that, for example. So it can be used for the initial marketing expenses as well. Angel investors typically invest in the seed funding round and also sometimes in Series A. However, they generally tend to invest more in the seed funding round because the seed funding round is actually a lot riskier than the Series A funding round, for example. So angel investors typically tend to invest more in the seed funding round than they do in the Series A funding round. So the seed funding round is actually a much riskier investment. And the risky investments, that's where the angel investors tend to step in. So startups need to have a good idea of how much funding they need in the seed funding round. This is, like I said before, in order to avoid giving away too much equity, and also to know how much your startup is actually valued at. So here's an example. Let's just say that you want a £30,000 investment in exchange for 10% equity. That means that your startup is valued at £300,000 as an example. So this is a very, very important thing for startups to look out for, especially when they're forming their company. You need to know how much you want to value your company at, and knowing how much money you want in exchange for how much equity you want to give away is a good way of calculating what the value or what you valued your startup at. Whether or not people agree with you, that's another conversation. But that's an example of how you sort of give your startup valuation. Angel investors have become one of the most popular ways for startups to actually get funding. So as I mentioned before, they tend to invest in early stage startups. So an early stage startup that an angel investor would potentially invest in would have a great idea, an excellent foundation team with the right skills, knowledge, and experience, and a profitable market. And they're looking for ideas that have the potential to actually disrupt the marketplace. So in the tech sector, we refer to those as disruptive technologies, as an example. So angel investors in the UK can only take a maximum of 30% equity in any startup. And they're actually regulated by the government to protect startups. So in the UK, there are various incentives that the government offers for people to actually invest in startups. So people that have disposable incomes can technically register to become an angel investor. So there's what's called the SEIS, that's the Small Investment Enterprise Scheme. Now, both of these schemes actually offer tax breaks that include inheritance tax breaks, for example. So let's just say an angel investor acquires shares in a company and they later on pass away. They might be able to actually leave that to their estate or to their next of kin when they pass away and actually get a reduction or an exemption from inheritance tax for those shares. There are also income tax breaks as well that the SEIS and EIS could potentially offer. So you actually get a tax cut because you've invested in a startup. And also there is what's called a capital gains tax break as well. So capital gains tax, and also there's a capital gains tax break as well. So capital gains tax, that's the tax that you pay on shares and property. So as an example, if you've got disposable income and if you invest in a startup that's eligible for the SEIS, right, you could actually end up being exempt from paying any tax on the shares that you've bought in that startup, especially after it becomes successful. So this is how the UK government has been trying to incentivize people with disposable income to invest in startups. Now, since the 2008 financial crash, banks have been far less likely to take risks by giving loans to startups. Some banks may match fund, but that requires the startup actually having the capital there in the first place for the bank to actually then match fund. So in the end, match funding by banks is actually inaccessible for most startups. Angel investors have been filling this gap and have actually really saved the day in many ways by actually filling the gap for startups that don't fit bank lending criteria. So I don't know if many of you remember the 2008 financial crash. That was 9 years ago now. For some of us, it feels like just yesterday, but it's actually been a long time since then. And there've actually been a lot of innovations in the tech sector because of it. So in many ways, the financial crash actually helped startups and the tech sector actually get funding for their businesses. So now we're actually going to go in and actually break down the specific things that angel investors look for in a startup. So as I mentioned before, one of the most important things that angel investors look for in a startup is a foundation team. Typically, investors ask for a co-founder. They generally don't go for someone who's a one-man band. Some technology accelerators can actually take someone on who's a solo founder, but they encourage you to get sort of co-founders as well. I've actually published a blog post on tech accelerators, which we've put in the description of this podcast. So if you're in the tech sector and you actually want to accelerate your startup, have a look at our blog post. Now, the foundation team needs to have the right knowledge. So, people, who've worked in the industry for years, or people who have degrees. The right mix of knowledge, experience, and sometimes even strategic partners as well can actually become good co-founders as well. So the foundation team is of critical importance because the angel investor needs to know that there are actually people at management level that are capable of actually giving them a return on their investment and actually running the business effectively. The next thing that angel investors look for is, of course, your idea. So your idea could be a unique product or service which fills a gap in the market. So this could be a completely new idea for a product, or sort of making a much better version of an existing product. So for example, the Dyson bagless vacuum cleaners. Vacuum cleaners have been around for a long time, since the 60s probably, but Dyson invented the vacuumless one. So that's an example of an existing product which was improved and actually became a smashing success. It could also be delivering a new service or delivering an existing service in a new and innovative way. So, for example, we have Uber. Regardless of what you think of the brand, they have been quite successful. There's nothing new about ordering taxis with an app on your card. The Addison Lee app in London, for example, has been around for years. But the way Uber delivered that specific service was quite innovative, and that's why they were able to actually disrupt the market. So, innovation can just be doing something which is already being done, just with a bit more thought, basically. So, and as mentioned before, these ideas must have the potential to actually disrupt the marketplace. Another thing that angel investors look for is knowledge of the marketplace that you're actually trying to access. This is of key importance, of course. They need to know how big the market is, what the current trends in the market are, and how much of the market share your business could potentially take. So good market research and a solid financial plan are key elements of a well-prepared pitch. So there are professional market research firms that can actually do some market research for you, but they tend to be a bit expensive. Some local councils anyway, especially in Staffordshire, actually do free market research for startups as well, for this reason, because, as I say, professional market research can be quite expensive. And again, a financial plan, that's something that sort of a financial analyst or someone who did business management can actually draw up for you as well. So angel investors, they don't typically expect to actually make any profit in the first 3 years of the business. So we advise very strongly that you keep your financial plans realistic. If you expect to be making profits in the first to second year, that can actually make angel investors suspicious of your figures and actually give the appearance that your figures are just not grounded in reality, basically. So just keep the financial plan realistic and try to avoid financial plans that predict a profit in less than 3 years. The next thing angel investors actually look out for in a good pitch is proof of progress. So how much progress has your startup actually made, with evidence of key milestones that your startup has reached? So angel investors invest in more than just an idea. They want to see how much progress you've made in actually sort of making that idea a reality. So an example of proof of progress is brand awareness. So for example, how many followers have you got on your social media? How many views and subscribers have you got on your YouTube channel? How much traffic do you get to your website? Are great examples of sort of traction and building brand awareness. So you need to be building brand awareness constantly before your product actually launches. For a lot of tech startups, especially, or the idea or the product or service doesn't actually get to market until sort of 1 to 2 years, as an example. So building brand awareness is a key milestone for actually showing investors how much progress you've made. So also things like prototypes as well. They're also another good example of that. But a lot of startups, especially tech startups, don't even have a prototype yet. They actually need the seed funding to actually develop their prototype type thing. But having a good idea of how much the prototype costs and how it's going to be developed can actually give the investor confidence that your startup's actually able to produce a working prototype. And also having a digital marketing strategy in general, so creating content, creating YouTube videos, creating podcasts, that kind of stuff. That can also give an investor confidence that you're trying to build your brand and that you actually have a customer acquisition mechanism in place for you to actually build brand awareness and actually convert traffic to your website and convert prospects into sales. The next key milestone is, does your startup have any recognizable intellectual property? So I touched on intellectual property before. So these are things like patents, registered designs, trademarks, and copyright. So what are these things for those that don't know? Having a patent actually gives your startup a competitive advantage. It gives you legal recourse to stop companies copying your product or service. So if someone has breached your patent, for example, you could have the right to sort of tell them to stop trading, or to say that you want a cut or a percentage of the profits they're making. So a patent, especially in the tech sector, is of key importance for an investor. So having a competitive advantage, that's absolutely crucial. And one of the main things startups actually use angel investors for is actually applying for a patent, because it can be quite expensive. It can range from £500 to even £5,000 to get a decent patent application drafted and submitted. A registered design, that actually just protects the design of the product. So that's not for logos. Logos, that's something else. Logos are there more for trademarks. So the aesthetic aspects of your product or service, especially when it comes to products, a registered design can actually protect those. Registered designs can actually cost far less. This is here in the UK, of course, to actually get sorted out. And a trademark is another key form of intellectual property. A lot of startups don't know that a lot of businesses like Netflix, for example, can actually borrow money against their trademark because the brand actually has itself value. An example of this is like, let's just say someone's created an excellent shoe, well designed, really, really brilliantly made, and someone's created a not so great or innovative shoe, something that looks like a Converse. Converse are still great shoes, but they're not sort of like wow in terms of their design. And then Nike just goes and puts their tick on there. People are far more likely to buy the less well-designed Converse because of the trademark and the brand that's been attached to it than, of course, the much more designed shoe. So having a brand and having that legally yours so that no one can actually go and try and steal your name, that's of key importance. So having a trademark, that can actually boost your startup in so many different ways. And actually, these days, startups are actually moving more towards holding intellectual property rather than having sort of fixed assets. So another example, again, is Netflix. Netflix is actually pledged to invest $8 billion in content in 2017, 2018. And of course, they'll own all the intellectual property rights to that content. So, content, things like podcasts or YouTube videos, that's copyright. And you actually license out your podcasts or your YouTube videos or your blog posts, for example, to other media organizations in exchange for a price. So these are all examples of the kind of intellectual property that angel investors actually look for. The next thing that angel investors look for is a good business plan. Now, a good, solid, detailed business plan, which can actually be part of your pitch, is essential. And also having what's called a business model canvas. Sometimes certain investors or certain accelerators prefer a business model canvas because that just explains all the different channels and all the different aspects of the business in a sort of diagram rather than a long, lengthy business plan. So it's up to you, but having a business plan at the very least is a key thing that angel investors look for. So taking the time to actually produce a good business plan or a good business model canvas is good practice when it comes to securing an angel investor. So this can be done you actually get, obviously someone who's experienced in writing business plans to actually do one for you. Some local universities could actually help you by actually writing a business plan for your startup, part of the uni work for these students, as an example. So establishing relationships with institutions like universities is really great for startups because they have the skills base that startups need as well. So, where to find angel investors? A good place to start, of course, would be online. There are lots of websites across the world that specialize in sort of getting angel investors for startups, or at least getting you in touch with angel investors. So these angel investors, they can actually create what's called a sanitized pitch. So just the key information an investor would need. Not necessarily a detailed business plan, uploaded, just a sanitized pitch. And there are a lot of websites out there that specialize in this. They can act as a sort of middleman to start communications between you and the angel investors. Now, we've carried out some extensive research on the various angel investor websites to save you the time and hassle of actually having to look through them yourself. And the one that we recommend is called the Angel Investor Network. Now, the Angel Investor Network has investors from all over the globe. It has new angel investors that register every day. Now, the great thing about the Angel Investor Network is that not only do they have a large network of investors across a whole range of sectors, is that they also give startups a money-back guarantee if they don't actually manage to get interest from an investor. So let's be clear, they won't give you a refund if you fail to get an investor. They'll give you a refund if you fail to get interest from an investor. That's an important thing to bear in mind. We actually received an investor from the Angel Investor Network, so that's how much we sort of recommend it. But obviously, we encourage startups to sort of do their due diligence on each investor that they potentially want to do business with. You've got to do your due diligence in any case. Something goes wrong between you and that investor that you found, it's not necessarily Angel Investor Network's site. All they do is just the link, the go-between. But any transactions, any investments, anything like that, that's actually done between you and the investor. So we've actually included a link for the Angel Investor Network in the description of this podcast. Okay. And hopefully you'll have a great experience, and hopefully this will be, your start on your journey to actually getting an angel investor. And hopefully clicking on this link will actually allow you to scrap that 9-to-5 that you hate so much and become an entrepreneur. So we hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please visit our YouTube channel, which is at Urgos Content, and subscribe to our email list and our blog as well. We have more videos coming up and more podcasts coming up. So the next podcast that's being produced is one on technology accelerators and the role they play in actually accelerating and getting tech startups off the ground. That's actually being adapted from the blog post that we've already published about technology accelerators. So if you want a sneak peek of that blog post, we've also left a link in the description for that blog post. Please also like and follow us on social media. That's on Facebook at Urgos Tech and also on Twitter at Urgos Tech. That's it from us.